I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that I need your help to keep this show going. If you appreciate the work I do, please consider supporting me on patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. You can also make a donation through PayPal if you email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors, so it is you, the listener, that will be helping to keep this show going in the future. Now, with that out of the way, we've got a very interesting edition of the show today as we are joined by Michael Meeropol, the son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, if you're not familiar with the Rosenbergs, they were the first American civilians to be executed for charges of espionage during peacetime in the United States. This is during the era of Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare. The Rosenbergs were convicted for spying on behalf of the Soviet Union and executed by electric chair at New York's Sing Sing prison on July 19th, 1953. Since then, the sons of the Rosenbergs, Michael Meeropol and his brother Robert, have been seeking to uncover the truth about their parents and whether they were wrongfully convicted. In the years since, it has become a definitive fact that Julius Rosenberg was engaged in espionage. However, Ethel Rosenberg is a different story, and a recently declassified NSA memo, Michael and Robert argue, is the smoking gun pointing towards Ethel Rosenberg's innocence. We're going to be talking about that with Michael on this edition of the show. So with that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on. I heard him recently on Doug Henwood's Behind the News program, and I thought to reach out because I think he has a very important story to tell us, especially when it comes to just a very heinous injustice. I'm speaking with Michael Meeropol, the son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and there's been some developments in this case that we really need to talk about. But first, maybe you could tell my listeners a little bit about who Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were, in case younger listeners may not be familiar.
My parents were son and daughter of immigrants. growing up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Um, they were activists. They actually had joined the American Communist Party, and they had a relatively ordinary life. He managed a machine shop. She was a stay-at-home mom, although she had worked a lot in textiles and as a secretary when she was much younger. Um, then on July 17th, 1950, I'm listening to the radio. I'm a 7-year-old. And all of these guys come in the house. And before I know it, I hear my mother say, "I want a lawyer." And that changed all four of our lives forever. Um, that night, I actually stayed up, listened to the radio, and they said that he was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage in wartime. And more importantly, that it was something to do with the atom bomb. And I also heard when I was 7 that he faced the death penalty. And that was the beginning of 3 years of, trauma and struggle while they went through a trial and got convicted, while they were sentenced to death for allegedly stealing the secret of the atom bomb and placing our nation's very survival in jeopardy. And the judge accused them of causing the Korean War. When President Eisenhower denied clemency in 1953, he said that they had probably doomed future victims of nuclear war to a horrible death. So those were the two people who America, was taught to hate and demonize. Turns out, almost everything about the story that was told was false. It is true that my father during World War II got involved with a bunch of friends who are engineers and scientists in trying to help the Soviet Union win World War II. And that it is also true that one of his recruits turned out to be an army machinist at the Los Alamos location of the Manhattan Project, where everybody who's seen the movie Oppenheimer knows what I'm talking about, because that's where the movie is set. And you even meet one of the scientist spies, Klaus Fuchs, in the Oppenheimer movie, and Oppenheimer is later told that Fuchs was a spy. He was quite surprised, needless to say. But there was this army machinist, happened to be my mother's brother, a guy named David Greenglass, and he had done some work to try and describe some of the things he was doing at Los Alamos. Under no circumstances could we say that what he did was the secret of the atom bomb, but the government promoted it and made a big deal about it to justify the death sentence. And why was there a death sentence? Because the government knew that my father had recruited a bunch of people and they wanted him to roll on them. And that's where my mother comes in. The evidence is very clear, and I can go into details about it if people want, that my mother was a stay-at-home mom, did not participate in my father's activities, maybe as a safety play. He gets arrested, she stays home with the kids, who knows? But there's a lot of evidence of that, including a recently released 70-plus-year-old memo that was just released this summer, which I'll be willing to talk about as well. So to summarize, they were accused of stealing the secret of the atom bomb. They were convicted, sentenced, and executed for stealing the secret of the atom bomb. My mother, summary, was totally innocent. My father was, in effect, half framed. He was guilty of some things, and certainly guilty as charged, conspiracy to commit espionage. But the alleged major overt acts to support the atomic stuff, he didn't have anything to do with it. And I can go into details about that. So my brother and I, as we became adults, we had always believed our parents were totally innocent. So we're talking about 50 years ago, we launched a national and international campaign to reopen the case. We wrote a book, we gave speeches, we filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that lasted almost 10 years, produced hundreds of thousands of pages of material from the FBI. We learned a lot, including the fact that my father was involved. And people might say, well, why did you ask for everything when it's possible you would have been proven wrong? And our argument always was, we're in favor of Freedom of Information Act. We're in favor of letting the chips fall where they may. And that was our reason for going ahead with the lawsuit. And when it proved that my father had been involved, we accepted it. I mean, it's reality. We still think, of course, that he didn't deserve the death penalty, and we also think that the atom bomb part of his trial, a lot of that was perjury. And all the stuff about my mother was perjury. And that's one of the reasons why back in 2016, we asked President Obama to officially exonerate our mother. And we're doing the same thing now with President Biden because President Obama didn't respond to our request. This time, we're absolutely certain President Biden will respond because we have the help of my brother's congressman,
Jim McGovern.
Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, a wonderful guy who's written to President Biden and is going to push as hard as he can between now and January 20th.
If you could, I hope this isn't too much of a side note, but what was it like for you and Robert growing up in the shadow of all of this? Is that okay to
Well,
ask?
no, absolutely. Those 3 years were really rough years. There's no question about that. We went to one grandmother's house who it turns out she didn't want us there. And we were in a children's shelter, which I hated. When I wrote about it as an adult, I claimed it was like something out of Dickens. That's probably an exaggeration. Then we lived with our paternal grandmother from June of 1951 to June of 1952. Went to public school in New York, started to visit our parents in prison. And then we lived with family friends in New Jersey from June 1952 to December 1953. And during that time, of course, our parents were killed. And after that, my parents' lawyer, who they had given full guardianship of Robbie and me, placed us with Abel and Ann Meeropol. And that was, I don't like to sound flip, but it's like winning the lottery. Rob and I were very, very fortunate and lucky, and honor them like crazy because they basically saved our lives.
In terms of this, well, I want to get to the National Security Agency document, but I guess what has the fight been like trying to get these documents over the years? Because I talk to a lot of people that make FOIA requests, and it can be a pain sometimes getting anything out of these requests.
Well, to give you an idea, we filed our lawsuit in 1975, and the judge gave them a kind of good faith effort. So they worked very hard and gave us about 180,000 pieces of paper. And then probably for 9 years, we litigated. And I think in the end, excuse me, my brother might know the exact number. I think in the end, we liberated 300,000 pieces of paper from the federal government, a lot of it FBI, but not all FBI. And the final judgment was entered in 1984 with the appeals court in New York, which, by the way, included, I think, both Bork and Scalia, found that the government had done enough. What was interesting, though, is that because Venona, the National Security Agency's secret project to decipher Soviet-era messages during World War II, was secret, we didn't know the NSA had any stuff. We didn't know that until 1995 when the NSA released a whole book full of Venona transcriptions and a press release and a 2-day conference. I actually went to one of the days. But it took us a while to realize that probably the NSA hadn't released everything. And so a couple of years ago, we said, hey, we better fill this gap. And we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the NSA. We were very specific. It was about code names. It was about our mother. And the result was that they have started to release material. They haven't released it all, but they narrowed it down to 88 documents. Now, a document could be 100 pages long, remember? So then they gave us the first batch, and in the first batch was what I consider a smoking gun. It was a memo written by the chief linguist decryptor of the NSA, a man named Meredith Gardner, who in 1948 had decrypted a message that referred to my mother. He was already quite suspicious because that message didn't include a code name for her. And it said, does not work. And he speculated in 1948 that might mean does not do conspiratorial work. Well, in 1950, 2 years later, after a lot of work on a lot of documents and a lot of back and forth with the FBI was running down stuff, he worked very closely with an FBI guy named Robert Lamphere. In fact, they're both the subject of an interesting book by a guy named Gerald Blum called In the Enemy's House. in any event, Gardner writes a memo 10 days after my mother's arrested. And in the memo, he goes through all the people who were either arrested or suspected of being part of an atomic spy ring. And he's got a couple of errors in there. He calls Greenglass a scientist. But when it comes to my mother, the most important thing is he writes these following words: knows about her husband's work, but due to ill health, does not participate in the work. The word the modifies my father's work. No more ambiguity. What this means is that Gardner, after 2 years of research and figuring things out, had come down on the side that she was not a spy. Now, that means, my brother loves to say this, and I'll quote him, that both the KGB, who never gave her a code name, and the NSA, who decrypted KGB messages, believed she was not a spy. And yet, that information never got to the defense. It never got to the public. The judge, in sentencing her to death, said she was a full-fledged partner in my father's crime, which is absolute nonsense. One of the only reasons that people even begin to suggest that she was somehow a leader in this is that she's 2 years older than him. I mean, that, when you think about it, first of all, it's the 1950s. Sexism was galore. The man ran the household. She was, an independent woman in her own light. She had been a union organizer. She had worked. But when they got married, she basically stayed home. And, the idea that she was leading him and that she was a full-fledged partner is out of whole cloth nonsense. On top of that, from as early as 1975, we had evidence that a lot of the evidence about her at the trial by the two chief prosecution witnesses that she had typed up spy material, that was perjury. And at first, we just noted contradictions between the early statements and the trial statements. But on 60 Minutes 2 in 2001, David Greenglass himself said that when he talked about seeing my mother do the typing, he was committing perjury. And he was committing perjury because his initial statements said she was not involved. And a prosecutor, the infamous Roy Cohn of Senator McCarthy, Angels in America, and Donald J. Trump, the infamous Roy Cohn was the guy who examined David Greenglass at the trial. So when he's working on the testimony before the trial, he says to David Greenglass, look, are you going to call your wife a liar? Or are you going to change your testimony to agree with her? And David Greenglass changes his testimony to agree with her. None of that early testimony is available until the 1970s. And so we've got two things going on. We've got Gardner's view, which got to the FBI, we know, which led
So
Hoover.
J. Edgar Hoover would have had access to this, the
And
FBI director.
yes, and he did not, he recommended against the death penalty for my mother. And I'm sure it's because of the information he got from Lamphere. Now, he might not have shared it with very many people, but he's the guy who's orchestrating the case. And we have the perjury, the proven perjury about the typing. So no more typing. She does not work. That means does not participate in the work of her husband. So we think we have.
Real quick, not to interrupt you, but that's really key here is
I'm
the
glad you
point.
reacted like that.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, the because it says the work. She did not participate in the work. It's not saying
yeah,
she didn't participate in work. She was a stay-at-home mom. It's saying she did not participate in the work. And within this context, the work was espionage.
yeah. Well, it's because right above it, it's knows about her husband's work and knows with two names, two code names, but due to ill health, does not participate in the work herself. I mean, it's so clear, and I'm glad you reacted the way you did because that's what happened to me when I first read it and I saw the word "the" there. I said, "Well, maybe I'm reading too much into this," so I wanted to get other people to do it. Everybody has responded the same way you did to the word "the." Well, not everybody. There are idiots who go online and say, "This is nothing new. This is nothing new."
In terms of where do you go from here? Um, do you think that there will be an exoneration made?
I don't know. Exoneration, it turns out, is a very rare thing. It's not like state governors who do that kind of thing. So what we're going to very explicitly ask for is an apology. Any kind of statement. Look, if Biden got on YouTube and said the conviction and execution of Ethel Rosenberg was wrongful for a variety of reasons, just said that. That would be our version of exoneration. What we would like is for Biden to look at the evidence. Look, he's also the first president to be opposed to the federal death penalty. What better example is there of how horrible the federal death penalty is than the execution of somebody who, you know, on the face of it is totally innocent? I mean, obviously, we can't prove that she never did anything, but we can prove that the government didn't think she did anything. And we can prove that the something that she supposedly did was perjury on the part of prosecution witnesses, and that the KGB never gave her a code name. I mean, there's so many reasons to think that. And one other thing, I forgot to mention this. How do you like that? The day my father was arrested, the head of the Justice Department Criminal Division said there's not enough evidence to indict Ethel Rosenberg, but she might be useful as a lever against her husband. And J. Edgar Hoover wrote that as well in some of his memos. And J. Edgar Hoover willingly used her as a lever, even though he knew Gardner's memo. There's no way he never read Gardner's memo. Either that or Lamphere read it to him or Lamphere described it to him. But because Lamphere, the FBI liaison between Gardner and FBI headquarters, was in touch with Hoover. He's the reason Hoover recommended against the death penalty, which I've already said before.
If you could you talk about a little bit more about the responses to this declassified document? I have an article pulled up right now, actually, from a website called The Conversation. The article is entitled, "I wrote a book on the execution of the Rosenbergs for Cold War spying, and a recently declassified document has convinced me that Ethel was innocent." That's by Lori Clune,
Yeah,
who
she's a
wrote the
fine
book.
historian. I
Yeah,
know her because
she
I've
wrote
read.
Executing the Rosenbergs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what she succeeded in doing in that book is uncovering a whole bunch of messages between consulates all over the world and the State Department. Um, when she started her research, she was told that there was nothing there, and she basically stumbled upon a cache that was, hundreds and hundreds of messages, and from that cache, she created a story about the worldwide campaign to save my parents by getting Eisenhower to grant clemency, and the impact it had on the State Department. Uh, but she also was early on when we asked for an exoneration from Obama in 2015. She was skeptical, and that's the whole point of this article. She's done what good historians do all the time. She's looked at the evidence and she's made a judgment.
I was going to ask another person, are you familiar with Dave Lindorf's work by any chance?
Yes, I know Dave. I've read his book. I've seen his film. We've exchanged emails over the years. He's a fascinating guy. He speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese in addition to everything else he's done in his life. Um, and he interviewed at length Ted Hall and his wife. Ted Hall was the other scientist spy at Los Alamos who helped the Soviets build their first implosion style bomb. He was young. He was like 19 when he was drafted and sent to Los Alamos as a wunderkind physicist. It's interesting that he didn't make it into the film Oppenheimer. I guess they didn't want to muddy the waters with two spies. Um, in any event, yeah, I met Ted Hall once before he died, and he told me that the day of my parents' execution, as it loomed, he and his wife had actually suggested to their Soviet contacts that he come forward and say, no, they didn't steal the secret of the atom bomb, I did. And his handlers dissuaded him. They said, you're not going to save them. All you'll do is put yourself in the hot seat. And the day of the execution, they took a long drive, and it was very, very painful for them. Um, but they ended up living really great lives and making contributions. And Dave Lindorf thinks that Ted Hall saved the world from the first nuclear war. Um, One could argue about that. I'm not a historian of science, so I'm not as fluid with the argument about how much U.S. espionage helped the Soviet Union build the first bomb. But there's no question that if it speeded it up, the Soviets had enough bombs to deter the United States from a plan. It was probably um, created by uh, um, General, who the hell was the guy? The Air Force guy. General LeMay, General
Yes,
Curtis LeMay, the
Curtis LeMay.
Strategic
Yeah.
Air Command guy, who had basically arranged, they were going to do 400 bombers, and they were going to wipe out the entire Soviet Union before they had a chance to develop an atomic bomb. But they developed the bomb too soon, and that plan was scrapped. Dave talks about that plan in his book. I think Daniel Ellsberg was the person who revealed that plan at some point during his life. I know most people would say, "Oh, we would never do that. We would never attack a country that hadn't attacked us." Well, I mean, that's laughable, of course.
I wanted to ask you, how important is it that the KGB gave all its agents code names? There was no code name for your mother, so I want to dive into that a little bit more because I do think that's the other important element of all this.
Yeah, and that was the element that we noticed right away in 1995, and we we didn't make a big deal about it. But my daughter Ivy did a film called Heir to an Execution. She did it in like 2001, and in that film, you see us being somewhat agnostic about Venona. Uh, my brother says, yes, it could be true, or it could be CIA disinformation. We don't know. And I remember saying on the film, look, if Venona is true, then the United States stands completely condemned for taking a hostage, my mother, and killing her. But those, notice all the ifs in there. So the fact that she didn't have a code name was a first step. But I think Gardner's judgment in that August memo that has just been released, I think that's the icing on the cake, or the final uh, piece of the puzzle, or the smoking gun, whatever kind of cliche you want to describe it as. And what's
Right, and
interesting,
this, just to clarify, so the August 22nd, 1950 memo, I think it's written more than a week after Ethel Rosenberg was arrested and about a
correct.
month after Julius Rosenberg's
Yes.
arrest.
Yes.
So I want to get the timelines right here. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, in that memo, there's also a reference to somebody else who never got a code name, a man who was a witness against my father because my father tried to recruit him, but a man who successfully fobbed off my father's requests. So he never committed espionage, and the government didn't indict him. And the fact that this is another person without a code name and the government doesn't indict, I mean, that's an indicator that the government knew what they were doing.
I wanted to ask you about before this memo came to light. You wrote a piece in the Monthly Review back in, I believe,
Oh,
January
thank
of
you.
this year.
Yes,
Judge
indeed.
Irving Kaufman, the liberal establishment, and the Rosenberg case. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, we always knew that Judge Kaufman was a very ambitious hanging judge. What we didn't know until we began to get FBI materials is that he also was a incredible buddy of J. Edgar Hoover, and he was constantly in touch with the FBI. So he was telling the FBI things that he did that basically violated the rules of the game. Like, for example, consulting with prosecutors without defense counsel present, agreeing to give the death sentence before the trial even began, that kind of thing. And even after the trial and the last episode, I think, was in 1975. He just was constantly trying to immunize himself from scrutiny. And he would make efforts to interfere with this or that. I mean, we looked at these things in 1976. We held a press conference and we published a document we called the Kaufman Papers. And I went to his office, and of course, I didn't get to see him, but I said, we want to see him and talk about this. And they said, you can't just walk in off the street. So I gave them my address and phone number, and they never called me back, of course, pretty straightforward. But so come to find out that after my parents' execution, he develops a great liberal track record with a whole bunch of rulings that supposedly put him on the liberal side of the ledger. And a guy wrote a full biography of him in which basically the story is that he did all these terrible things in the Rosenberg case, although the guy doesn't admit to how bad they were. But then he rectified it, but with decades of positive contributions. And what the Monthly Review and I argued is that there's no contradiction between good old-fashioned American liberalism and virulent anti-communism. And I use examples: Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Hubert Humphrey, Felix Frankfurter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I took detailed notes on the book, and I did not use half of them because it would have been like, inside baseball. What I did instead was write about the broader question, and I was very pleased that Monthly Review accepted it because it's a perfect venue for that kind of argument. Yeah, I mean, I think the book does a somewhat okay job on some things. I was highly critical of other aspects of the book. And you know, I hope if people are interested, they can read my article. I think it's online now, right?
Yes, I will include a link to it.
Fantastic.
So this memo, I think it came out. So it's 74 years to the day it was written.
Yep.
What does this say about the issue of
Well,
government
they
secrecy and transparency in our country?
what it says is, I'm going to speak on the other side of it, that something different has happened in the Biden administration with this woman, Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, who has argued that too much secrecy does harm. And she argued for transparency. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people in the NSA said, all right, it's a very old set of documents. It's a legitimate FOIA request. It fits perfectly with what Director Haynes has been saying. And we got all these members of Congress who are asking for it as well. Let's remember, it wasn't just Robbie and me. There were Jim Himes of the Intelligence Committee and Jim McGovern. There were probably about seven, maybe nine senators who have specifically asked Avril Haines to release the rest of the stuff that hasn't been released yet. So I'm thinking maybe the NSA's turned over a new leaf. Maybe the NSA is interested in transparency. Now, what's going to happen under Trump, who the heck knows? Because he doesn't like a lot of the people in the intelligence agencies, but he certainly wants to have his own intelligence agencies, my CIA, my FBI, my generals. That's the way Trump acts. I mean, he's a mafia boss, basically. So, but for this short window, this fall, this summer, the NSA did the right thing. So I'm going to not complain that they kept it secret forever, because let's face it, we didn't ask for it until 2 years ago. It was partly our fault for not realizing in 1995 that there might be more documents and amending our original Freedom of Information Act request, but we didn't. So
In terms of the importance of this memo and this case, I mean, I hope that my listeners understand why this remains relevant. Because I don't think it's just a matter of the historical record needing to
mhm.
be correct. I think this has implications. I mean, it was a miscarriage of justice. And I mean, I understand you saying that you're not going to complain about it taking 74 years to get the document out there, but I think it says something that we do need this
Yeah,
kind of transparency.
absolutely, we do. And also, we have to remember that when politics contaminates the law enforcement system, the criminal justice system, injustices can occur. Now, Trump and his Trumpies, they believe that all the January 6th insurrectionists were arrested for politics rather than for committing crimes. I mean, what's crazy about that is you see them smashing a cop over the head. So it's not like, it's an invisible crime. Like my parents' alleged crimes were invisible. It's conversations that they had with David and Ruth Greenglass in the privacy of either of those apartments. That's basically the crime. And you can play lots of fast and loose with crimes of conspiracy, because I had a conversation and so said yes. Well, the so says, no, 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 I didn't say yes. I said no. Who are you going to believe? Well, what happened in my parents' case, it was real easy. They asked my parents if they were communists. They took the Fifth Amendment, and the jury said to themselves, they're hiding something. End of story. So political contamination of the judicial system is a reality. And this is one example of it. And the more we expose them, the better it will be in the future.
I know this is speculative, but do you think a reason that it has taken so long to get these type of documents is part of it? Do you think certain agencies maybe it's not that they want to, cover up some big secret, but it's almost like I think these things can be embarrassing to an agency's history.
Certainly possible, although in this case, the NSA looks good. I mean, it's the NSA's precursor, Gardner, who writes the memo. It's the FBI that fails to tell the Justice Department. So the Justice Department is able to build a case about my parents being top atomic spies, even including my mother as the typist and all the other stuff.
The FBI is the villain here, then. Yeah.
I think unless the FBI told the Justice Department and they chose to ignore it, I mean, there's no question that the facts of Venona were known full the government. They just weren't told how it happened. Roy Cohn had told Alan Dershowitz that they knew for sure because they'd bugged a foreign embassy, because that was the cover story they used. It's a source of unimpeachable veracity, which is the Venona project. But we don't think President Truman was told about the Venona project. We do think President Eisenhower was.
Just one or two more questions. What was it like when you and Robert first read this memo? Because I mean, I'm assuming there's been lots of years of just pain and trauma associated with this case for both of you, and
Yes.
this seems to prove that she was innocent, which is in a way I could see that being a relief, but also it also shows that she was unjustly executed, which is
Yeah, well,
angering.
we have been, beating that issue since the 1970s, when we discovered the perjury about the typing, and then since 1995 when we discovered she never got a code name. So there's no question that we have been very, very sure. And that line, can't indict her, but she could be useful as a lever against her husband. All that stuff. I mean, as I say in Ivy's film, I'm talking about it. I say the United States government stands condemned doing what terrorists do, taking a hostage and murdering the hostage. I'll tell you one more. I mean, some of these things, they just hit you, like a wet blanket or something, blast. A New York Times reporter who had written a biography of David Greenglass was interviewing a former assistant attorney general, a man named William Rogers, who was Secretary of State under Nixon. That's how people know him. But in the 1950s was a young assistant U.S. Assistant Attorney General. And this is 1990. He's probably going to die very soon. This reporter says, well, in the Rosenberg case, you got what you wanted, right? You arrested them, convicted them, executed them. And Rogers said, we didn't want to execute them. We wanted her to talk. And so the reporter says, what went wrong? And the assistant attorney general from the 1950s says, she called our bluff.
Wow. That's all I
Yep.
have to say to that. Wow.
Yep. Yep. When I read that, I almost jumped out of my chair.
I was quiet there for a second because that was like a mic drop, the
Yeah.
way you told that
Yeah,
story.
yeah. Well, it's so dramatic. It's just unbelievable. What's amazing, by the way, one of the things about that is note the word our. It's a team effort. And that was one of the most important things I did in my January article in the Monthly Review. I said that Judge Kaufman knew he was on a team when it came to prosecuting my parents and making sure they got convicted. And in sentencing my father to death, what's fascinating is because Hoover had recommended against the death penalty, Kaufman knew there was disagreement in Washington about what to do about her. So he specifically told the prosecutor not to make a recommendation. And then he lied from the bench, saying, because of the seriousness of the case and the lack of precedents, I have refrained from asking the government for a recommendation. In fact, he'd sent the prosecutor in Washington to talk to the Assistant Attorney General, the Attorney General, to Hoover. They got all sorts of different opinions. And so when he talked to the judge on the phone the day before sentencing, he said, look, Your Honor, there's differences of opinion in Washington, D.C. And he said, okay, don't make any recommendation. So I speculate that Kaufman took it upon himself to sentence my mother to death because he was an immigrant Jew, son of immigrant Jews, who had climbed the American dream, become a successful lawyer and prosecutor and then judge. And he looked at my parents, who were same generation, children of immigrant Jews, and they had adopted communism. And he despised that. And I think that was why he wanted to sentence both of them to death, because he felt they were like vermin who needed to be stamped out. So I speculate that that's his decision. The decision to sentence my mother to death is his decision alone, and not a team effort. But the team effort was my father's sentence to death. No question about that.
You mentioned earlier, I whenever I read new articles about this case, people say, well, um, Julius was a spy, but Ethel wasn't. And I think you have a slightly more nuanced view of your father. Could you
Yeah.
speak more to that? And let's get into
Okay, I
detail.
can. And by the way, there's another article which I wrote in 2018, in which I investigate the case against both parents and use the grand jury testimony of David and Ruth Greenglass, as well as government documents, and a wonderful book that was written in 2010 by Walter Schneer called Final Verdict: What Really Happened in the Rosenberg Case. And in my article and in Walter Schneer's book, we find that in the year that David Greenglass testified, he gave my father a cross-section diagram of the implosion-style bomb, the Nagasaki bomb, in September of 1945. In that year, my father was out of the espionage loop. The KGB had relieved him of his duties for a couple of years between January or February 1945 and sometime in 1947. We have evidence of that from the KGB's own documents. So what Walter Schneer was able to find is that almost the entire atomic espionage charge against my father was fake, that it was David and Ruth Greenglass reducing their activities, sloughing some of the activities onto my father, that helped get a death penalty for my father. So the government was happy. It helped reduce the culpability of the Greenglasses. Ruth Greenglass was never even arrested, and David Greenglass was sentenced to 15 years. He served only 10. So my father was half guilty. So, it's sort of weird. How do you plead half guilty? And so he and my mother just decided to plead innocent and hope for the best, because the trial was riven by what are clearly misconduct on the part of the prosecution, perjured testimony, et cetera. And it came very close. It took a fix at the Supreme Court to end a stay of execution on June 19th, 1953. I mean, there had been a stay granted. It probably would have lasted another 6 months before it came back to the Supreme Court. But they came into special session, quickly overturned it, and my parents were killed. They got one extra day of life. They were killed Friday instead of Thursday. But in other words, there was a lot of stuff going on. And the people who worked to save my parents' lives ended up generating a tremendous amount of interest, even in the United States. It's hard to believe, in the height of the McCarthy period, when this committee was all attacked as being, crazy communists. None of them were communists, by the way. Very interesting, which is one of the reasons the government never tried to put them on the Attorney General's list. But they certainly said they were all communists. And they did a marvelous job. 26,000 telegrams arrived at Eisenhower the last week, the vast majority in favor of clemency. And the entire set of our allies in Western Europe, particularly the French, were appalled by what happened. And that's one of the great things about Laurie Kloon's book. She's got evidence of that. So my parents put their faith in the justice system, and they came damn close.
What lesson do you want my listeners to get, not only out of the story of your parents, but also just this period that we know as the McCarthy period, that maybe they didn't learn when they had a history class in school that went over it for maybe one class or a few minutes or whatever.
Well, I think the most exciting story of all is one that people probably don't think of, and that is that a handful of mavericks stood up against the United States government, were accused of being communists. They had virtually no money to start with. They had one set of articles in one newspaper, and they had the trial record. They duplicated the trial record, and it revealed very quickly that the case against my parents was nothing but oral testimony of co-conspirators, of confessed spies. So they were able to build this incredible coalition of people who thought the trial was unfair, who people thought my parents were innocent, who people thought the sentence did not fit the crime, for some people who thought they were guilty and they shouldn't be executed anyway. The result was a very broad coalition that tried to get Eisenhower to give clemency. And it was unbelievable considering it's in the 1950s, the height of the McCarthy era. The Korean War is raging, and these people succeeded in breaking through the barriers and getting thousands of Americans to ask Eisenhower to commute the sentences. And later, close to 4 million people contributed to a fund to help my brother and I with our education and life beginnings, which was very helpful, paid our college tuition, for example. Um, Unbelievable. Yeah, that's the story I want people to take. No matter how horrible things are, you can fight back if you are true to yourself and you don't try to hide things. They were very transparent. They didn't hide anything. This bunch of people on the committee, and the result was that they broke through some cracks. And since, and now I'll get very political today, since we have a wannabe Viktor Orban who wants to be the new fascist leader of the United States. Huey Long was assassinated, so he never made it. Joe McCarthy was a raging drunk, so he never made it. Um, Richard Nixon was tripped over his own feet, so he never made it. But Trump wants to do it right now. And everybody who is involved in the resistance, do not despair. If that group of people could come so close to getting Eisenhower to grant clemency while the Korean War is raging in the middle of McCarthyism, they had so much of a higher hill to climb than we do. The lesson of the 1950s is fighting back works. And I urge people, I'm part of that process. I've given a whole bunch of speeches about fascism yesterday and today, and I hope to do it again. I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to fight back on every level, and we've got to support the people who are fighting back. There's all these podcasts that you can read, you can see. There's these people who have Substacks. I read about 4 of them a day, and I'm very impressed with people who are fighting back. Not particularly impressed with news media who are already surrendering.
I wanted to ask about that because when you mentioned Kaufman and the story you wrote, or the review you wrote of that book, I was thinking about, we're seeing media figures like Scarborough, Morning Joe, um, basically sort of bend the knee towards Trump. And I feel like there were certain people that identified as liberal in the McCarthy era that sort of bent the knee towards the sort of
Oh, no,
anti-communist witch hunters.
no question. But let's remember, the liberals were anxious to purge communists from what existed in the New Deal coalition. That's behind the formation of Americans for Democratic Action in 1948. It's the result. I mean, Hubert Humphrey cut his eye teeth kicking communists out of the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party. I mean, there's no inconsistency because the liberals liked some part of the New Deal, but they didn't like being friendly with the Soviet Union, and they didn't like communists and unions. So they were, in effect, very happy to marginalize communists, I mean, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., this great liberal who wrote about FDR, he publicly supported the death penalty in my parents' case. So it's important that people realize that liberals from time to time do not like leftists. And certainly
you're saying they were complicit in the
Yes.
liberal establishment was complicit
Yes.
in the Rosenberg case. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's no question. I mean, Kaufman's a Democrat. It's a Democratic administration under Truman that is indicting them. Truman, there was a clemency appeal to Truman. He just passed the buck to Eisenhower. He didn't say yes or no. He said nothing.
So before you get going, this would probably be a better question for Robert, but I don't know if you could add anything about the I know your Robert runs or founded the Rosenberg Fund for Children. I don't know if you want to plug that at all.
Oh, absolutely. I'm on the advisory board, but it's been his baby since 1990. Every once in a while I get to be at some of those events that he sponsors. It basically, I think it came to him that what happened for us, people helping us go to college, et cetera, helping Ann and Abel Meeropol, finance us. They weren't rich. They were ordinary people. And Ann made relatively little money. He said one good turn deserves another. And he decided to start a foundation that would help kids of people who have been targeted because of their progressive activities. Later, I guess 10, 15 years later, they expanded the catchment to targeted activist youth. And they have given away millions of dollars over the years, music lessons, money so a kid can visit his father in prison, a whole host of things. They've hosted gatherings of the recipients, which, I mean, it's just a fabulous, fabulous organization. Go online, www.rfc.org. You'll find out everything you need to know about it. And amazingly, when my father got to retirement age, his older daughter, Jennifer, took it over. And so she is now the executive director, and he's like some senior eminent grease, who, comes on for this, that, and the other thing. It's a fabulous organization. Yeah, if there's anybody out there who hasn't contributed to it, go online and do so. That's, by the way, the center of the Exonerate Ethel campaign, where you can sign the petition and you can see much more details than I was able to give in this discussion.
So there is a way for people to voice their support for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a national petition. And it's available. And we're asking people to do more than just sign. We're asking people to take a piece of paper that says, I signed, and take a picture of yourself and then send it to the RFC. We've had some relatively prominent people do that.
Well, I hope for the best. I would hope the government can at least give an apology. I hope that Biden goes for that.
Yeah, but we just don't know. There's no way we know. I mean, he's got a lot on his plate. But this is, he could do this in 30 seconds.
Well, let's hope for the best. Thank you again, Michael.
Oh, you are more than welcome. I am very much looking forward to listening to it. And thank you for giving me all this time.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Michael Meeropol. And as always, if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff It's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.